with Sam Wessel, who is going to be the new assistant director. So welcome, Sam, and I hope you will find the center a congenial and friendly place to work in the coming years. So we're really delighted to.
I look forward to it.
Exactly. Thank you very, very much. On Friday, we have another lunchtime talk by Laura Gladowski, who is one of our postdoctoral fellows. Laura will be talking about fringe theories and epistemic tolerance. Next week, it's Thanksgiving break, so we have a well-deserved break. I'm definitely looking forward to it. There's nothing at the center, and however, after the Thanksgiving, we have 2 more weeks of talks. The first talk after Thanksgiving is going to be an online talk by a former fellows, and James Fraser will be giving the talk on the 29th of October. So the talk is online. You should register for the talk. So the link is not today yet to the website, but we hope to put it today or tomorrow. I will send a reminder anyway so that you can register for the website, get the invitation, and listen to James talk.
Will you also be watching from here?
Probably we'll do a watch party here as well. Right. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Riet van Bork. Many of you know Riet. Riet is currently an assistant professor at the Psychological Methods Department, University of Amsterdam. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the center in 2021 during COVID. So while Riet was actually in COVID for a while, she was not at the center because the center was closed. And I'm very happy that she was able to come back as a fellows this semester. Most of you have already met Riet, but as you know, Riet works as a psychologist and methodologist. She works in Psychometric, the measurement and identification of psychological capacities. She's particularly interested in the development of network methods to do that. She's published on a range of topics in top journals in psychology and methodology, psychometric methods, psychometrica, and so on and so forth. I don't want to take too much time. Riet, the floor is yours. Measurement and network approach to psychopathology.
Thank you for the nice introduction. So today I'm going to talk about measurements in a network approach to psychopathology. And so I will mostly sort of introduce how I get to this measurement question, and then point to the questions. And I don't really have answers yet, but I hope to convince you that these are important questions that should be investigated. And I will introduce this by first explaining what the standard paradigm is of measurement in psychology, how the network approach basically offered an alternative perspective to this. And then from the perspective, I will go to the models, so the statistical models that we use to estimate networks. Then the network theory that's sort of led to these network models, and that's draws on dynamical systems. And then I will get to the question of how to do measurements given this theory. So starting with the standard paradigm, so this is in the field of psychometrics, where we do measurement methodology. Typically, constructs are measured using latent variable models. And these latent variable models assume that whatever you want to measure is in some underlying dimension. And we observe effects of this dimension. So for example, in the case of depression, we observe that people have symptoms. And the model assumes that your probability of having different symptoms depends on your level of the underlying depression. So the more depressed you are, the higher the probabilities of different symptoms. And these symptoms can differ in probability, so that some are more common than others. But for each of them, it's the case that if you would get more depressed, the probability of all of these symptoms would increase. And so this relies on a theory of seeing these constructs as common causes, where the idea is that if someone gets depressed, then this sort of drives these symptoms. And so, yeah, you get these symptoms as a result of your underlying depression. And then if you get more healthy again, these symptoms disappear again. And I think this way of thinking about the construct and the role between these constructs and the things that we observe, so symptoms, for example, pushes also a research line in which we go look for these underlying causes. So, for example, Thomas Insel, was head of the NIH, and here, for example, said we should no longer fund research aiming to relieve symptoms without probing underlying causes. So we should look for this underlying cause, because if we can solve that, then that will solve the symptoms. And so it also pushes sort of, yeah, seeing mental disorders as brain disorders. And that whole view sort of goes nicely with the analogy of seeing mental disorders as diseases. So similarly to how we cannot directly observe from looking at someone whether that person has the measles virus, we can actually observe all sorts of symptoms of measles. And then, because we assume that these are caused by this virus, we can identify the underlying disease. And so this perspective has all sorts of implications. For example, it means that we can use sort of symptom checklists to identify the underlying disorder or disease. The disorder explains why symptoms go together. So, for example, seeing that someone has sleeping problems gives you some information on expecting other kinds of problems. So sleeping problems correlate with feeling sad and concentration problems, etc. And that's explained through this common cause, because if you know that someone has sleeping problems, that's basically some sort of indication of that person being depressed. And we know that depressed people also tend to have these other symptoms. And sorry. And that's similarly with the disease. And this also implies things about what these symptoms are. So, for example, in this perspective, symptoms are interchangeable indicators. They don't have unique roles in the system. They can be sort of more or less strongly caused by the common cause, but they don't have unique roles in the system. And so it is also more important to focus on the number of systems than on the nature of symptoms, so which symptoms exactly. And it means that symptoms are independent when you would condition on the mental disorder. And that's the assumption of local independence. So if you would look at people that are all equally depressed, then all of these correlations between symptoms disappear, or that's implied by this theory. And that means that the correlations between these symptoms are seen as spurious. They are not because they causally interact, it's really because they all rely on this underlying cause. So it's sort of similar as suppose you have multiple scales with that measure weight, and you assume that all of them fluctuate a little bit. So if you put the same thing on there, it doesn't always give you the true weight, it just varies a little bit around it. And then if you have multiple items of different weights and you put them on multiple scales, you would see that the heavier things are heavier on all of those scales. So there are correlations between the weights of these things on the 3 different scales. But that fully disappears if you would look at only things of the exact same weight. So then there are still fluctuations, but they don't correlate between scales anymore. So that's the sort of driving assumption after for fitting these latent variable models, is that we look for items that are locally independent. Yeah, so here in this view, disorders are all their own latent variable. And we can try to identify them and classify people having different disorders. But in clinical practice, it typically looks a bit different. So for example, there's a lot of heterogeneity within diagnosis, and that not only that people have different symptoms just because, you know, it's a probabilistic relation between the symptoms and the disorder, but actually that there are stable patterns where people have different patterns of symptoms. There's comorbidity, so certain disorders tend to go together. And again, you could in this other view explain this with just putting a correlation between the two latent variables. But that wouldn't really account for systematic patterns of symptoms that go together that are of different disorders. So it's not random if you know that someone is depressed and has certain depression symptoms. It's not random what kind of anxiety symptoms that person has, but there's actually overlap of symptoms between disorders. So how can we account for this complexity? That's then where the network perspective comes in. And this network perspective uses a very different analogy than disorders as diseases, which is that taking inspiration from ecology. So for example, in shallow lakes, you also have all sorts of components that make a lake healthy or unhealthy. So a clear lake or a turbid lake. And these components all interact with each other. So for example, if the water is clear, the sun more easily gets to the plants, and therefore there are more plants growing, and therefore there's a better fish population, and all of these things interact. And this forms a sort of complex dynamic. And then sometimes you can have a shift to a turbid lake where all of these things are unhealthy. But you wouldn't explain that with an underlying lake disorder. And yet, if I would look at different lakes and I would look at all of these components, I could probably fit a factor model and find this latent factor because all of these things correlate with each other. So lakes that tend to be bad in certain things like whether there are enough plants, etc., are also bad in other things like algae or other components of the system. So now we have two alternative perspectives of how to look at the symptoms of a mental disorder. That's either as a sort of underlying disease, and that goes well with the latent variable model, or as a sort of ecosystem of components that interact with each other. And that's where the network model comes in. So the idea of a network model is that symptoms reinforce each other. So if I cannot sleep and I'm tired, these are two different symptoms, then in a latent variable model, this would be explained through, well, they both are caused by your depression. But maybe because I cannot sleep, I am tired. Similarly, I have had panic attacks in the past. Also, I'm afraid of getting a panic attack. Well, maybe these are two indicators of the underlying panic disorder, or because I have had panic attacks in the past, I will be afraid of getting another panic attack. So basically, this sort of alternative explanation just look, these symptoms, they influence each other and they keep each other active. So then we have two different explanations. The latent variable perspective explains the clustering of symptoms that we reliably see in data through common causes, and the network perspective explains this through certain symptoms that reinforce each other will cluster. So from there we get to the models that we actually estimate from data. So in a network model, you have nodes and edges, the lines between the nodes. And the nodes then are typically variables. So this could be the presence versus absence of symptoms. But it could also be the scores on different items in the questionnaire. And then the edges represent some statistical relation between these nodes. So the simplest form of making a network could be just where the edges represent the correlation between these nodes. You can also look at partial correlations, which is basically the correlation between any two nodes conditioning on all other nodes in the system. Or you can try to estimate conditional dependencies, which gets kind of, yeah, with partial correlations, you try to get at these conditional dependencies. So again, are they dependent, conditional on other items in the, or nodes in the network? And so that also means that psychological networks differ from networks in other fields because the edges are not observed. We need to estimate them. So it's really a statistical model here, which is a bit different from, for example, social networks. So you choose nodes and then you use some construction rule to estimate the associations between nodes. And then this association can be different things. But typically we're looking for conditional dependencies. And the reason for that, I think, is it's the theory is a sort of causal one where things reinforce each other. But it's really hard to actually get at the direct causal relations, also because we just have many nodes. And then these conditional dependencies are sort of, yeah, in between level between correlations and all of the different causal models that would be consistent with the conditional dependencies. And so we see that as a sort of, or I see it as a sort of generating hypothesis about where there could be interesting causal relations. You would obviously need more to actually go and infer these causal relations. Yeah, so this is how we typically estimate them if we have continuous data. And I will show how simulations show what you sort of get given some true model. So if the data generating model is some model that has conditional dependencies, then if you would look at the correlations and make a network of that, you get sort of similar clusters, but you see that there are just many edges in there that are spurious. The partial correlations already get much closer because you now condition on all of the other items in the network. But there are still many edges that are just very close to zero. And so what we typically do is that we actually also use some regularization where we penalize the complexity of the model by pushing edges that are close to zero to actual zero, just so that basically the network becomes more interpretable. And if you would have zeros in your actual conditional dependencies, you would hopefully get them back. And yeah, you see under like nice properties of continuous variables and multivariate linearity, etc., then you get it nicely back. Yeah, and to give some empirical example, so this is, for example, a network of the depression symptoms. And then you can so this is also, again, one where there's this regularization used. And now you can start sort of interpreting this network by looking at whether there are interesting clusters. You can also look at centrality measures. So for example, which node has a lot of strong connections or the betweenness. So how often does a node appear on the shortest path between other nodes? This can be, for example, interesting to find what kind of symptoms are bridge symptoms between different clusters. So maybe you have some anxiety cluster and a depression cluster, and then there are some nodes that we're connected to. And so for each of the nodes, you can get these kind of centrality scores. This is, for example, a network of multiple disorders in the DSM. And blue here is anxiety disorder, and white is major depression disorder. And you see that these clusters are separate, but they're also close to each other. And then you can also interpret, for example, oh, this might be interesting. This number 8 is actually related closely to stuff in what we count as anxiety and to stuff that we count as depression symptoms. And in this case, I think that's actually sleep problems. So that can be interesting to learn from a network. So you basically then also explain comorbidity completely different than this traditional perspective. And yeah, then the network theory that we have built mostly on this analogy with the ecosystem, so seeing it as a dynamic system. And to show that, I will show a little simulation. So here, this is hypothetical network. There's no connections yet, but there will be connections in a little bit. So suppose you have like, yeah, these nodes. And what we're gonna do is the nodes can be connected very strongly or not so strongly. And then you can put external stress in the system. So there are things from outside that activate these symptoms. And then in a case where there's low connectivity, so first now you get the edges, so not everything is connected. And they're not so strongly connected. And we're going to increase the stress on the system. And you see that with more stress on the system, more nodes turn on. And then if we decrease the stress, then more and more nodes will turn off again. And what is quite interesting is that it's, yeah, it just sort of gradually increases and goes down again. But now we go to a different setup where we have the same network, so we'll get the same edges, but now the connections are very strong. So first there are just no symptoms present. And we increase the external activation. And I think it's already higher than it was in the last one where you would already have half of them on or something. And then suddenly, boom, they're all there. And now actually around 1.5, they all turned on. And now you go back, but they're still on. Even though there's less stress than there was to begin with, and then boom, they're gone again. So this is something that's quite interesting that sort of follows from the theory of seeing symptoms as being connected to the dynamical system, which is that if the network is very strongly related, you get things like state shift, so you can flip from one state to the other, and you get hysteresis where at different points, I think I have yeah, so strong connectivity leads to sort of having alternative states that are quite stable. So even if you're in a depressed state and you take away some of the stress, you're sort of stuck in that state. Whereas if you're in a less connected network, it's more continuous. And you have hysteresis where the transition from one state to the other is not at the same place. It depends on whether you are already in a depressed state, and you will have to decrease the stress a lot more before you will go back to a healthy state than when you're already in a healthy state where everything sort of keeps each other healthy. And so this could generate all sorts of hypotheses. For example, maybe sometimes treatment doesn't really work because even though you get rid of stress things around the system, these things keep each other activated. And so maybe you should actually intervene also in the structure of the network. Yeah, and these weakly connected networks are therefore seen as more resilient and better than these very strong networks where you actually really get stuck in this disordered state. Yeah, so in this network theory, mental disorders are then viewed as stable states in the system where you can have a depressed state and a healthy state. And you can end up in such a depressed state because the symptoms cause each other and sustain each other, as well as external stress on the system. So external stress can turn on some of these symptoms and then they keep each other activated. And depending on the landscape, someone can really get stuck in such a stable state, or it's more of a sort of healthy landscape where you just move a bit easier from an unhealthy state to a healthy state. And then we get to network measurement. So at this point, we're still doing measurements with latent variable models. And psychometrics is concerned with questions like how should we select the items and how should we combine the information in these items to get a measure. And at this point, we're just doing that based on this latent variable model. But in previous work, I have both shown that if you don't think that the thing that you want to measure is actually a common cause, that you lose most of the justification for all of the choices you make in a latent variable model. So for example, this assumption of local dependence is key to the latent variable model, but it just follows from seeing it as a common cause. And if it's not a common cause, there's no reason why you would expect that. And there's also no reason why you would, for example, only look at whatever is shared between items. So that's in the latent variable model, you look at the variance that is shared between items because that is what reflects the common cause. So if you don't think that, then there's no justification for doing that. And also, in other work, we have shown that if it's not a common cause, then this can actually also just really lead to severe bias in relations between different constructs. So basically, if you think my construct is actually a network, then what should you do? Because the way we now do measurement relies on all of these assumptions that you don't believe in anymore. So basically, the network perspective gives a different explanation for why symptoms cluster. It gives different statistical models, and it gives also a different conceptualization of what actually the target of your measurement is. So if you want to measure how severely depressed someone is, now depression is basically something else than it was in the latent variable model. So if we want to go to something like network measurement, to situate it with different measurement theories, I think it's part of test theory. So you have different types of measurement theory, but test theory views the measurement problem statistically. So you have different types of test theories. I will talk a little bit about them in the next slides, but classical test theory, generalizability theory, modern test theory are all test theories in which there's a probabilistic relation between what you observe and the thing you want to measure, and you expect that there's some noise in your measurements, and that's why you use probabilistic relations. And I think now that the easiest way to come up with a new measurement theory is to find something that is sort of analogous to these kind of test theories and try to see how they differ from other test theories. So, for example, the test theories differ in how they conceptualize the measured construct. So in classical test theory, the thing that you want to measure is conceptualized as an expected value over repeated administrations of a test. So there in classical test theory, you have true scores and error scores, and an item is the sum of a true score and an error score, and you want to get this true score, and the true score is the expected value over repeated administrations of the same item. And I think this is nicely explained with this thought experiment in Northern Novik, where it's Lazarsfeld who came up with it. Suppose we ask an individual, Mr. Brown, repeatedly whether he is in favor of the United Nations. Suppose further that after each question, we wash his brains and ask him the same question again. Because Mr. Brown is not certain as how he feels about the United Nations, he will sometimes give a favorable and sometimes an unfavorable answer. Having gone through this procedure many times, we then compute the proportion of times Mr. Brown was in favor of the United Nations. So it's also a bit of an operationalist view of what the construct is, because it's very dependent on your test, and then you do the test over and over, but you don't actually do this hypothetically. Hypothetically, you do them over and over again and get this expected value over different administrations. And then in modern test theory, the thing you want to measure is a common cause. That's what I already explained. So it's now viewed as the cause of whatever you observe. And then the first research question is, what is this dimension in a network theory? So I don't have a real answer to that yet, but I have some thoughts. So one question first is maybe in a network, because it's a multidimensional system, there is just not one dimension that we can call depression anymore, but rather you just have all of these items and it's a multivariate system, and we should give up basically the goal of finding a dimension that we can measure. But I do want to investigate whether there are whether there is maybe one dimension or two or something that gets at the depression structure. And in a network, I think there are sort of two dimensions that are very interesting. One is this, in what state are you? So are you in the depressed state or are you in the healthy state? So that's basically sort of your location in this landscape of the system. And the other thing would be the health of the system itself. So you could be in a healthy location, but have a very unhealthy landscape in the sense that you very easily go to a depressed state and get stuck there. And I think it's interesting to pull these apart, because I think they actually also get at different understandings that already exist in the literature, in the sense of, if we, for example, talk about how childhood trauma causes depression, I think it makes more sense to think of such a relation in how it changes your landscape, rather than whether it predicts whether you are now in a depressed state or in a healthy state. Whereas other types of causes, things that now happen in your life, will predict really whether you are now in a depressed state or in a healthy state. So these are different dimensions. And so again, this health of the landscape is then maybe close to what resilience is in ecosystems. So I think, we can again draw on literature on ecosystems to sort of get inspiration. So resilience is a very important concept there. For example, in this literature on ecosystems, Martin Scheppers writes, prevention of perturbations is often a major goal of ecosystem management, not surprisingly. This is unfortunate because it distracts attention from the underlying structural problem of resilience. The main implication of the insights presented here is that efforts to reduce the risk of unwanted state shift should address the gradual changes that affect resilience rather than merely control disturbance. And so the idea is sort of like, it's very hard to predict whether a system will go from one state to another. You have work on early warning signals to try to predict whether someone, for example, will shift in a depressed state. but it's very hard to predict that. And maybe a very important factor is that we try to intervene on how healthy the landscape is. That with therapy, we try to form a landscape that's resilient, where people, even when there's stress on their system, don't easily get stuck in a depressed state. And for example, Gabi Dunansky, a colleague of mine, has written a very nice dissertation that you can also find online about how to think of resilience in mental disorders, and showing, for example, that different types of networks correspond with different landscapes that are characterized by different levels of resilience. So, yeah, for example, that a network that's more strongly connected makes the state more stable, and therefore can get stuck in a depressed state. Yeah, so that about like what is depression. But then the next question is, if we then find some dimension that we're happy about, and we say, okay, so now the mental disorder is this dimension that we want to know. A next psychometric question is then, how should we select items? And again, I think the answer for the network theory is going to be different from what we already have. So for example, in classical test theory, because you basically want to get at this expected value over repeated administrations, and you cannot really wash people's brain, you try to find items that get at the same true score, but just differ in random noise, basically. So that it's as if you take the different items, it is as if you do repeated administrations of the same true score, but then with different error. In modern test theory, so in the latent variable models, you look at items that are effects of whatever you want to measure. And because in this common cause framework implies local independence, we typically use local independence assumptions to select what items conform to this common cause structure. But in network measurements, we maybe might want to include very different kind of items. And that's actually also a problem now for developments in networks, because now we estimate network models typically from questionnaires of items that are selected based on the latent variable theory. But it could be, if you open that up, it could be very interesting how maybe we should make networks very differently, which then would hopefully lead to improvement in the network theory, improvement measurement, stable iteration. That would be great. And then the third question would then be, how should we, if we know what kind of items we want to get at, how should we combine the information in these items? So in classical test theory, you add items and weigh them by how reliable they are. So how much true score variance is there compared to the error variance. In modern test theory, you add items and weigh them by how much they share with the latent variable. This sounds very similar, and it is very similar, but there are cases where they differ. So the important difference is that you could have in the latent variable model, you could have unique causes of the items that are reliable or systematic that you cannot have in the classical test theory model. But in the latent variable model, yeah, that's considered unreliable, basically, because it's unique. But anyway, so they are a bit different, but yeah, with network measurements, I'm really not sure. Also because, you know, with the first question I had some idea, with the second, but like they all build on each other. So here I have no idea yet. But I think there are very important questions that should be investigated. Maybe people would argue, well, maybe it will give us things that are very similar to what we're already doing. And although I doubt that, actually, I think if that were the case, it would be super nice, because I think if it implies super different things, that will be maybe very impractical, whereas if it implies things that are similar to what we're already doing, that's nice, and it means that we sort of have a new foundation for what we're already doing, or maybe what we are already doing, we have to tweak it a little bit to make it consistent with the networks. But so either basically this investigation leads to, oh, we should do things very different, get very different kind of items. And then I think it's just very important to know, because, you know, if we actually believe in these network theories, that's then apparently what we do. Or it gives us something. So for example, I can imagine that if you're really interested in what state someone is, it might still be the case that counting what symptoms someone has is sort of a nice measure of in what state someone is. But then at least if we can show that, then we have a new foundation for the things that we are doing. And I think it could also just give as a bonus other types of new information. For example, maybe if we start reconceptualizing the construct and defining it in a different way, that would give answers to problems that we have in other measurement theories, such as a big problem is always whether mental properties, so any psychological constructs, are quantitative. Maybe we learn about some of these constructs that we do see them as some property of a network that is quantitative. Who knows? And I think if you look at the different test theories, they have all given us something else. So for example, classical test theory gave us the concept of reliability, and then with modern test theory gave us the concept of item bias. And yeah, who knows what a new measurement theory could give us for new sort of advancements in measurement. So I'm done a little bit early, but I thank these people for examples and figures that I've used in my slides. And thank you.
Hi, we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll have plenty of time for questions.
That was really great. Yeah.
What do you first?
No. I think in some parts it's like